Hey everyone, welcome back to a Coder's Journey. This is episode 7 of our Formik in React series. If you haven't watched the previous episodes, make sure you do because we are building on what we have already established over the past few episodes. Also, remember that the link to the complete solution file is in the description, so feel free to grab them and explore the code base if you want. So in this episode, I want to talk about handling form submission using asynchronous actions and server errors probably in Formik. Before we jump into the code, let's quickly align on what we are trying to achieve here. At the end of this part, we want our form to behave like a real production form. Not just, something that looks good, but something that actually works end to end. So basically, we want to be able to grab the data and then send that form to our backend. More specifically, we want to submit the form data asynchronously, like a real API call. We want to be able to show a loading state probably while the submission is happening, so the user kind of knows that something's going on. We want to be able to handle server-side validation errors properly instead of failing, silently or showing a generic error. And finally, we want to decide whether to reset the form or keep the data depending on whether the submission succeeds or fails. In other words, we want the full, real world form experience. Now, before we, again, start coding, I would like to take a moment to talk a bit about how Formik helps us do all of this. Let me put some, words here so that we can talk about them. So in Formik, we have the onSubmit function, which is actually designed to work really well with asynchronous code. You don't have to, fight it or add a bunch of extra state yourself. When onSubmit runs, Formik gives you two important things. First, you get values. This is simply the current snapshot of all the data in your form, every field, nested objects, arrays, everything. Second, you get Formik helpers. So Formik helpers. Think of this as a small toolbox that lets you control Formik's internal state while the submission is happening. Some of the most useful helpers in that toolbox are set submitting. This toggles Formik's is submitting a state. You'll usually use this to disable the submit button or show a dialog or show a loading spinner or loading text. The next thing that you can do is that you can use is set errors. This one is really important for real applications. It lets you take validation errors coming back from the server and inject them straight into Formik, so they show up in line next to the fields, just like client-side validation errors. And then you've got reset form. So reset form kind of resets the form back to its initial values, which is perfect after a successful submission when you want a clean slate. Using these helpers together lets you do a few very important things. First, managing the loading state cleanly with is submitting. The next thing I would say is displaying server-side validation errors in a user-friendly way using set errors. Last but not least, you can reset the form only when it actually makes sense using reset form. So once you understand this flow, handling form submissions in Formik becomes pretty straightforward and honestly hard to mess up. Now at this point, we're done, pretending things. We are not sending any data back to our backend API. We want to be able to, actually send some data. We want to kind of, simulate a real submission and what that might look like. That's fine, for learning. You can probably take it to the next step yourself. But we are going to, implement a simple solution to kind of showcase how the form submission works, how we can communicate with our, backend API. So this is the structure of my application so far. The implementation that I want to, create in this episode makes the whole flow feel real because we will be, sending data somewhere. Let's talk about, where the logic for sending data back to our backend API could live because we want to keep the structure of our application clean as well. So instead of mixing API logic directly into our form component, we are going to keep things clean and organized. We want to create a folder first. I'm going to create a folder here. I'm going to call this API. So this folder is located at the root of our project. And inside of that folder, we can create like a new file, like job application API. So job application API. And then inside of this, this file is going to be responsible for one thing only, right? Handling the job application submission. And in this file, we would like to export a function that performs the API call. And then inside of our form component, we simply, import that function and call it. This separation keeps your components focused on user interface and behavior, of course, and your API logic will be reusable. And the whole code base will become, much easier to maintain as it grows. So let me go ahead and write the code to, export a function called submit job application. It is going to be, an asynchronous function that kind of communicates with our backend API. A simple API that I will be running on my local machine. If you want to know more, by the way, about asynchronous programming in JavaScript, I have another playlist on the channel that you can watch. But I'm going to talk about this piece of code. And finally, returning the data. So this piece of code is really simple, especially if you know a little about JavaScript programming. But let's take a closer look at this function and understand what role it plays in the whole application. So this function, which is called, submit job application, acts as the bridge between our Formik form and the backend API. It only has, one responsibility, which is to take the form data and send it to the backend server. Nothing more, nothing less. First, notice that it is an asynchronous function. And it receives values as its argument. Those values come straight from Formik and represent the complete state of the form at the moment the user clicks the submit button. And inside of this function, we make a fetch call to this address. You might want to adjust the port number. So we're using the post method, because we're creating a new resource on the server. We also set the content type header to application JSON, and we convert the form values into JSON using JSON stringify. Once the request is sent, we wait for the response and immediately, parse it here. We immediately, parse it using response.json, and this gives us access to whatever the server sends back, whether that's a success payload or validation error, whatever. Now, the next part is really important. I'm talking about this part. We check the response.ok. So if the request did not succeed, we assume the server is returning validation errors, in a structured format, something like an object where each key matches a form field name. And in that case, we throw the parsed response data. Why throw it? Because throwing the error allows the calling code, in our case, the Formik's, onSubmit handler, which we'll define in a moment, to catch it and pass those errors directly into set errors. That's how, server-side validation errors and end up, showing up in line in the form. And if the response is successful, we simply return the parsed data. This, signals to the rest of the application that submission worked as expected. So in summary, again, this function isolates all API logic in one place. It sends form data to the backend. It clearly distinguishes between success and failure, and it enables clean inline server-side error handling in Formik. That separation of concerns is what makes this approach scalable, testable, and production ready. We haven't implemented, the API communication in the component itself. Now that we have this, API function in place, the next step is simply, to wire it up to the form. We will need to import this function inside of our, component, basically, inside of our submit job application component. And then we will be able to, use it. Again, this keeps the API logic separate, but it's still easily accessible wherever we need it. We need to create, a function, an asynchronous handle submit function, and then we're going to call that function inside of our form component, and we're going to pass in the form values that come from Formik, and that's really all there is to it. So let's go ahead and create that function. This function is going to be placed here. I'm going to put it here. So we are going to call submit job application from our API. And if there are any errors, we're going to use set errors to show the errors. I just need to import submit job application at the top. So import job application from our, API. Let's talk a little bit about this function before we, use it. This handle submit function. Let's walk through what's actually happening here, because again, this flow is really important. When the user clicks the submit button, the first thing that runs is our handle submit function. This is the entry point for the entire submission process. I haven't added this, by the way, to the component yet. I will do it. Inside of this function, we call submit job application, which we just defined, right? This function is responsible for sending all the form data to the server. And at this point, the request is in flight, and Formik automatically switches into a submitting state. Now, if everything goes well and the server responds, successfully, we do two things. We show a success message. This is the, part that we, show the success message. That's just to, give the user some feedback. And then we reset the form so it goes back to its initial clean state. On the other hand, if the server responds with validation errors, we don't jump. We don't just dump a generic error on the screen. Instead, we use set errors. We use set errors to push those server-side errors directly into Formik. And the nice thing about this is that, the errors show up in line right next to the fields they belong to, exactly the same way client-side validation errors do. And finally, no matter what happens, success or failure, we call set submitting to false. This is the cleanup step. So it tells Formik, all right, we're done here, and it enables the submit button so the user can try again if needed. So this again function is placed inside of the component above the return statement of your component, right? And it is close to the component itself, but again outside of your JSX. That way your logic and your markup stay nicely separated, the file stays readable, and the submit logic is easy to find and reason about later. Now we need to update our Formik component. There is this unsubmit that you can see here. We are doing a simple console log here, but of course, as I told you, we want to change that. We want to be able to use that handle submit to actually submit the form. So I'm going to remove this part and add the unsubmit. And this is the way we submit, the use that submit button. And of course, the button itself. Let me go all the way to the end of the file, and I'm going to change the definition of this button as well. So let's talk about this a little bit. Before we move on, I want to talk about what is going to happen when we submit the form using this simple line of code, this one. Let's talk about this. When we pass, unsubmit with handle submit to the Formik component, we're basically telling Formik, hey, whenever this form is submitted, this is the function you should run. And from that point on, Formik is fully wired to our async API logic. Next, we get access to is submitting. This value again is managed entirely by Formik for us, and it automatically reflects the current loading state of the form. And I'm talking about, by the way, the button. So as soon as the submission starts, is submitting flips to true, and once everything finishes, it goes back to false. We then use the value inside of our UI, and while the API is in progress, the submit button is going to get disabled so the user can't click it multiple times, and the button text switches to submitting, which gives clear immediate feedback that something is happening. No extra state is needed, no manual flags, nothing. Formik handles all of this behind the scenes. Now, in order to test things out, I am using a simple, backend API running locally on my machine. This is, a simple API that I have used in some of my other playlists on the channel. Basically, there is this endpoint called, job applications or applications that I can invoke to get the current job applications or send job applications to. So this backend API is running now on my machine, and I have already tested this, and there is one job application inside of this backend API. So what I can do now is to test things out by filling out the form. So I'm gonna enter my name, and I'm gonna have a full-time job, and I'm gonna live in Main Street, New York, and this is the zip code, and of course my company is going to be Coder's Journey. I'm a senior software developer, and then I'm going to submit, and I'm going to agree to the form, to the terms and conditions. I'm going to submit, and I think it went through. Let me refresh this. No. So something's happening. Let me submit the form again. Yeah, this time it worked. So it says form submitted successfully. And if I go to my backend and refresh, I can see that a new job application has been, saved in the backend API. So at this point, everything is fully wired together. We now have a brand new, endpoint at /applications, and every time the form is submitted through submit job application, that data is actually persisted locally. So the really nice part again is that this works seamlessly with the Formik setup that we already had. Validation still works, loading states behave correctly, and server-side errors are handled in a clean, predictable way. No hacks, no workarounds, nothing. In other words, the form doesn't just submit data anymore. It behaves like a real end-to-end feature. That was it for this episode. Let's quickly recap the key takeaways from this section. We use set submitting to manage the loading state and lock the UI during submission. We use set errors to surface server-side validation errors directly inside the form, right where users expect to see them. And we use reset form to clear everything after a successful submission. And the most important thing, Formik onSubmit supports asynchronous operations out of the box, which makes this entire flow straightforward and reliable. Once you understand these different pieces, handling asynchronous form submissions in Formik becomes almost second nature. That was it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed watching it. If that's the case, make sure to give the video a like. Stay tuned for the next episode. See you there.